She stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, barking, "That fence violates code. Take it down or pay the fine." She had no idea. That fence? It's not just wood and iron. It's a registered landmark, built in 1924, signed off by the state. But what Karen didn't know is who my great-grandfather was. My name's Michael Reyes. I'm 43 years old, I work as a stonemason, and I live in the house my great-grandfather built with his own hands nearly a century ago. Our family's been on this street since 1919. We didn't just move into the neighborhood, we helped shape it. That fence Karen hates, it's not some DIY weekend project, it's a registered historical landmark. The state recognized it in 1982, and the first bricks were laid in 1924, during the same month my grandfather was born. I grew up running my fingers along that stone as a kid, tracing the initials etched into the corner post. It's the last thing my great-grandfather worked on before he passed. Every scratch tells a story. Every brick is part of our history. So when someone like Karen shows up with a tape measure and a clipboard, talking about modern compliance standards, it's more than annoying. It's offensive. She didn't see heritage. She saw an eyesore. This wasn't about trimming hedges or following a rule book. This was about dignity, memory, and standing up for something that deserves to last. Because if we let HOA busybodies erase the past just to satisfy some aesthetic preference, what do we lose next? Let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? And have you ever had to fight for something small that meant everything? Stick with me. Because what started with one woman's complaint about an oversized fence became a battle over history, identity, and the soul of a neighborhood. And what she didn't know, I still had the original papers, signed, sealed, and backed by the state. You ever live in one of Ho's neighborhoods where time just slowed down, where the air smelled like damp cedar in the morning and folks nodded at each other without having to say much? That was Willow Bend. That was home. I live on Ashbury Avenue, a narrow little street with old maples lining both sides like sentries, the kind of trees that rain golden leaves in October and fill the sky with fire-colored canopies by dusk. My house sits third from the corner, tucked behind a low garden wall and a tall, ivy-wrapped iron and stone fence. It's not flashy, not modern, just steady, like it's always been there, because it has. The house was built in 1921 by my great-grandfather, Elias Reyes, a stoneworker from Oaxaca who came here with a heart full of grit and a head full of plans. He worked sunup to sundown during the post-war boom, laying streets by day and shaping our fence by gaslight in the evening. Each stone in that wall, he picked it himself from the quarry 3 towns over, hauled them in a wagon. No cement mixer, no crew, just his hands, a chisel, and a quiet kind of pride. Growing up, I never thought much about it. The fence was just there, solid and permanent. We used to race bikes along it, tracing the ridges with our fingers. I remember my dad showing me the chisel marks, pointing out the signature on the inside panel. E. Reyes, 1924, stamped into the stone like a whisper from the past. Sundays were the best. My mother would roast a chicken, and the smell would drift into the street. Kids played with sidewalk chalk. Someone always brought out lemonade. The fence? It wasn't just decoration. It was part of the backdrop. It framed our memories. Neighbors would pass by and lean their elbows on the top rail to chat. Miss Geneva from across the street used to say it was like something out of an old mission courtyard. We all agreed it was one of those rare things that gave the street its so. Back then, the HOA was quiet. They mailed out a newsletter, sure, mostly reminders about block parties and community yard sales. Nobody was breathing down your neck about mailbox heights or the type of bulbs in your porch light. It was just a group of volunteers trying to keep the park benches painted and the sidewalks swept. Karen wasn't even on the board yet. In fact, I remember her first summer here. She and her husband moved into the Tudor at the far end of the block. She was polite, a little stiff maybe, but she brought cookies to the 4th of July picnic. Said they were from scratch. They weren't, but we smiled and said thank you anyway. At the time, I had no idea the tide was about to turn. See, back then, I had just finished restoring my garden. It was something of a tribute to my grandmother. She loved native plants. So I pulled up the Bermuda grass and replaced it with golden yarrow, milkweed, and lavender. The bees came back. The air smelled like summer. I even planted heirloom tomatoes along the inside curve of the fence, right where the morning sun hits. The vines wrapped around the rail like they knew they belonged. My niece would come by after school to help water. She's 9, curious about everything. We'd sit on the stone edge and she'd ask questions about the fence, about Elias, about why the wall was so much taller than most. I'd tell her stories I'd grown up hearing, about how he built it during the rainy season, how he nearly gave up twice, and how the town finally declared it a landmark in '82 after a local historian raised hell at City Hall. I still have the old news clipping, yellowed and crumbling, but you can still see the photo, Elias in suspenders, leaning on the fence, smiling that quiet smile of his. Right beneath it, the headline, "A Living Wall, Rhea's Family Legacy Designated a City Treasure." There was pride in that. Quiet, steady pride. The kind that doesn't need to shout. And for a long time, life stayed peaceful. We hosted backyard movie nights with an old projector. The fence worked like a sound buffer, kept the noise in, and made it feel like our own little world. Every December we hung lanterns from the top posts, soft amber light glowing against the stone. Kids would call it the castle. Some of the older folks called it Elias's wall. Even the postman knew the spot. It was part of the rhythm of the street. The peace wasn't perfect, of course. We had the occasional grumble about parking or trash day, but it was neighborly, it was fair. Then the leadership changed. Karen got herself elected onto the HOA board. Something about bringing order to a lax system. We didn't think much of it at first, but soon enough, the newsletters got longer and meaner. Suddenly, there were visual integrity audits, new codes, required paint palettes, talk of uniformity. Still, we figured the fence was safe. I mean, it's literally listed in the city's landmark registry, has its own file at the county clerk's office. They even referenced it in the local architectural tour a few years back. I was invited to speak at a historical preservation fundraiser in '18, showed them photos of Elias shaping the keystone by hand. So I didn't worry. Not really. Not when Karen made offhand comments about needing to modernize the street. Not when she started measuring curb appeal with a digital level. Not even when she said, at a block meeting, that oversized barriers send an unwelcoming message. I thought she meant the tall hedges at the corner house. Turns out, she meant my family's fence. But that realization hadn't landed yet. Not here. Not in this part of the story. Here, the air still smelled like tomato vines and iron warmed by the sun. The bees were still humming. The lantern hooks were still strung with wire from last winter, and the Rhea's wall still stood, tall, quiet, proud, waiting. The Rhea's wall still stood, tall, quiet, proud, waiting. I remember the day it began, not with shouting, not with threats, but with something worse, a smile. It was early spring, the kind of morning where the air smells like new rain and the earth hasn't yet made up its mind about winter being over. I was crouched beside the fence, trimming back frostbitten leaves from the yarrow. That's when I heard her heels. Click, click, click. Karen. She paused just outside the fence line, held a ceramic travel mug in both hands like it was a prop in a play. She wore a blazer, pale blue, perfectly pressed. Who wears a blazer on a Tuesday walk? "Morning, Michael," she chirped. "I see the garden's coming back nicely." I wiped my hands on a rag and nodded, trying to coax it out of hibernation. She smiled, tight, closed lips. "It's lovely, really, though I couldn't help but notice." She trailed off, eyes drifting upward, not at the vines, not at the flowers, at the fence. I said nothing, just followed her gaze. "Do you happen to know," she asked in a tone so artificially sweet it could rot enamel, "what the HOA's maximum fence height is?" I looked at her. "Not off the top of my head," I said, "but I do know this one's grandfathered in. It's a historical designation." Her smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes shifted. "Oh, I'm sure it's charming," she said. "But as head of the new Visual Standards Committee, we're conducting a neighborhood review, just to keep things harmonious." She took a sip from her mug like she hadn't just thrown a grenade. That was her first move. Subtle, plausibly polite. But under the surface, it was the start of a war. That afternoon, I found a flyer tucked into my mailbox. Unofficial, no envelope, no signature. Ashbury Avenue Alignment Initiative. A 4-page packet outlining proposals for modernizing outdated fixtures, reducing visual obstructions, and encouraging unified design elements. Fence height was listed right under non-conforming mailboxes and unsanctioned color palettes. There was a photo on the 3rd page. My fence, zoomed in, cropped, black and white, like it was a mugshot. Still, I tried to stay calm. Karen was new to the board. Maybe this was just overzealous ambition, a temporary thing. I was wrong. Within a week, I got my first official notice. Folded neatly. HOA letterhead, certified mail. This correspondence serves as a preliminary citation. Property located at 213 Ashbury Avenue contains a fence structure that exceeds the permitted height of 48 inches per Article 4, Section 8 of the Willow Bend HOA Guidelines. I stared at the letter for a long time. There was no mention of the wall's historical status, no acknowledgement of the city records, just a vague warning that if I didn't remediate, I could face escalating fines of up to $100 per day. I called the number on the letter, got an answering machine, left a message. No reply. Instead, I got an email 2 days later, this one from Karen directly. Michael, as a courtesy, I wanted to follow up regarding your compliance letter. I understand this may feel sudden, but we're simply enforcing long-standing rules that previous boards neglected. We appreciate your cooperation in restoring visual cohesion to the neighborhood. Respectfully, Karen Elbridge, Chair, Willow Bend HOA Visual Standards Committee. Restore visual cohesion? I forwarded the email to the City Preservation Office, just to be sure. The reply came the next morning. Mr. Reyes, we confirm that the wall at 213 Ashbury is recognized as part of the Reyes Residence Landmark Designation, file number 82114 Thorn B, protected under City Ordinance 10.6. No structural alterations may be required or enforced by local associations without city review and approval. Please contact you, as if further issues arise. I printed that email, framed it, and still, it didn't stop. A few days later, I noticed Karen walking the street with 2 other board members. Clipboards, measuring tape, one of them squatted at the base of my wall, the other took photos. I walked out to the porch. "Can I help you?" Karen turned, smiling. "Just a routine audit," she said. "Nothing personal." Nothing personal. That phrase stuck with me. It's what people say right before they hurt you and pretend it's policy. The next HOA newsletter listed target zones for realignment. Ashbury Avenue was circled in red. Someone started placing anonymous flyers in mailboxes. Non-compliant properties undermine home values. Mine was at the top of the list. And then the real harassment began. Late-night knocks on the door. No one there. Tire tacks across my front lawn. Someone dumped gravel into my rain barrels. I heard Karen on the phone once, while walking my dog. She said, "He's going to have to choose between sentiment and standards." I wasn't just a man with a tall fence anymore. I was a target. But even more than the attacks, it was the erasure that hit hardest. People who used to greet me now looked away. One neighbor, Steve, crossed the street when I approached. Another, Nancy, stopped bringing her grandkids to the garden tours I used to host. It was like the fence had suddenly become a wall between me and everyone else. I talked to my niece about it one afternoon while we watered the tomatoes. "Why are they being mean, Uncle Mike?" she asked. "Didn't they like the fence before?" I didn't know what to say. I told her sometimes people forget what matters, that they get scared of what's different or old, that they want everything to match because it feels safer. She looked up at the wall and said, "But this fence is safe. It's like a story you can't knock down," out of the mouths of babes. That night, I stood out, hid under the porch light, hands in my pockets, staring at the chisel marks Elias had left nearly 100 years earlier, his initials, still visible, weathered but proud. And I realized something. Karen wasn't just challenging a structure. She was challenging memory, legacy. She was trying to flatten history to make herself feel tall. That's when I stopped hoping it would go away quietly. That's when I started building a case. Because the wall wasn't just stone, it was proof, and I was ready to defend it. Because the wall wasn't just stone, it was proof, and I was ready to defend it. At least, that's what I told myself that night. But what followed was more than just a dispute over measurements. It became psychological warfare. The next HOA newsletter came out printed in color, 6 pages long this time. The cover featured a photo of a street from another neighborhood entirely. Manicured lawns, uniform mailboxes, knee-high white fences. The headline read, "Envisioning a Brighter, Cleaner Willow Bend." On page 2, in a section called Visual Blight Watch, was a heavily cropped image of my fence again, this time overlaid with a translucent red X. They didn't mention my name, but everyone knew. That same week I received a second citation, this time more aggressive. Final notice. You are required to reduce fence height to community standards within 14 calendar days. Non-compliance will trigger automatic fines at $100 day, accruing until full resolution. The letter included a tally sheet already printed with the next 2 weeks of dates, empty boxes next to each, labeled daily violation penalty, as if they were already counting. I filed a formal appeal with the HOA, cited the city's landmark designation, attached the preservation office's confirmation letter. I even emailed Karen directly, again, with a calm, measured message. No response. Instead, the very next day, I got a visit from a compliance officer, not from the city, no badge, no ID, but from the HOA's private contractor, a young guy in a branded polo shirt holding a clipboard and an orange measuring stick. "I'm just here to document," he mumbled. "Don't shoot the messenger." I watched him mark numbers down without a word. By that weekend, something changed in the neighborhood. People stopped making eye contact altogether. Cars I didn't recognize slowed down in front of my house, lingered, and then pulled away. A neighbor I'd known for 20 years, Mrs. Brenner, 2 doors down, crossed her arms when I waved to her one morning and said, "You should just take it down. Why are you making trouble?" Making trouble, as if preserving a century-old piece of city-recognized history was a nuisance. I found a note stuck to my front gate one morning, just a single piece of paper. "You think the rules don't apply to you because of some dead guy's rocks?" No name, just that sentence, scribbled in blocky Sharpie. Later that day, my niece found one of our tomato vines pulled out at the roots. I tried to report the harassment to the HOA, left voicemails, sent emails, nothing. When I showed up to the next community meeting, they'd moved it, no notification, different location. Karen claimed the email must have bounced. I wasn't on the list anymore. Still, I wasn't ready to roll over. So I reached out to the city's Office of Historic Preservation again. This time, I asked a direct question. Can an HOA legally override a city-protected landmark designation? Their answer? Absolutely not. Any alteration to a protected structure, regardless of HOA guidelines, requires city oversight and approval. Your HOA is acting beyond their legal authority. They even offered to send a representative to speak at the next HOA meeting. That's when things escalated. Sudda. Suddenly, I received a cease and desist letter from the HOA attorney. Yes, they now had legal representation. The letter accused me of defaming the association by misrepresenting their actions to outside entities. It warned that I could be liable for reputational harm. Reputational harm? They were the ones cropping pictures, printing red X's, and letting my niece find hate notes in the mailbox. This wasn't about aesthetics anymore. This was intimidation, a power play. And it didn't stop there. A neighbor, Todd, across the street, confided in me one evening, quietly, while taking his trash bins out. He said Karen was making the rounds privately, whisper campaigns, telling people I was a litigious risk to the neighborhood, that my fence issue could lower property values for the whole block. She told me it was just a matter of time before the city sided with her, he said. Said you were grasping at dead paperwork. Grasping at dead paperwork. That one stuck. I tried to hold on to normalcy, kept tending the garden, hosted one last Sunday dinner, but only 2 people showed up. The rest sent polite cancellations, busy, conflicted. Hope it all works out. Even the bees seemed quieter that week. Then, late one night, I was woken up by a sound I hadn't heard in years. Scraping. I looked out the window and saw 2 silhouettes at the edge of my property, one holding a flashlight, one with a tool. They were scratching something into the stone. By the time I got outside, they were gone. But they'd defaced the keystone, carved a crude X over Elias's initials. It didn't break the wall, but it cracked something in me. This wasn't just petty politics anymore. This was desecration. And that was the moment I realized they weren't going to stop. Not until they'd either bullied me into submission or erased the history entirely. But if Karen and her clipboard cronies thought I'd back down quietly, but they clearly didn't know who they were dealing with. Because I wasn't just a descendant. I was a stonemason, a preservationist, a man who knew exactly how to hold ground. And they had just made this personal. It was time to shift the story. No more defense, no more waiting for them to knock on my door. I was done being the polite man behind the wall. It was time to step around it. I was done being the polite man behind the wall. It was time to step around it. I started by pulling out a black binder that had been sitting untouched on my bookshelf for years. It was labeled simply, Rhea's Property, 1982-2005. Inside were the original city documents, blueprints, correspondence, even a photo of my great-grandfather standing beside the wall in 1924, squinting into the sun with his hands resting on the very stone Karen tried to erase. Tucked in the back was a sealed envelope marked City of Rosemont, Historic Site Approval Package. Inside, a signed affidavit from the Historic Landmark Committee, the property's original elevation sketches, and, my personal favorite, a notarized letter from then-Mayor Grace Lynn declaring, "The Reyes fence is to remain untouched, unaltered, and preserved in perpetuity under City Ordinance 10.64b. That one sentence, it had more legal power than any HOA newsletter ever printed, but I didn't stop there. I made 3 certified copies of the entire packet and hand-delivered them. One to the city clerk's office, one to the Office of Historic Preservation, and one, this part felt especially satisfying, to the regional office of the State Attorney General. See, most people don't know this, but when a historical landmark is threatened, it falls under the jurisdiction of both municipal code and state preservation law. And the state takes violations very seriously, especially when there's documented harassment or property damage. And as it turns out, I had documentation. Over the past 3 weeks, I'd saved every notice, every email, and every flyer. I had taken time-stamped photographs of the graffiti on the keystone. I'd installed a trail cam hidden in the honeysuckle vines facing the sidewalk. It didn't catch faces clearly, but it caught silhouettes and movement patterns, enough to show intent. Then there were the audio recordings. Thanks to my niece, tech-savvy as ever, I had installed a small microphone inside the fence post light fixture. I hadn't expected much, but what we caught was stunning. 2 HOA board members, standing outside, whispering. One said, "If we keep the pressure up, he'll cave. He's old school. He won't take it to court." The other replied, "Karen's already talking to a developer. Wants to open sightlines to increase curb value." And there it was. The real motive. Not safety, not harmony, profit. They wanted to erase my wall to boost property values, maybe flip the corner lot, maybe draw in higher value buyers with cleaner visuals. I had what I needed, but I didn't rush, because I also had something they didn't: time and training. What Karen never bothered to ask, what no one in the HOA ever even thought to check, was what I did for a living. I'm a certified restoration stonemason, licensed, bonded, and registered with the California State Contractors Board. I've worked on missions, bell towers, Wabibutu memorials. I train other masons in preservation ethics. I'm not just the guy with the old wall. I'm a state-level expert in keeping things like that wall alive. So I picked up the phone. I called in a favor from a colleague at the California Historical Structures Association. He reviewed my documents, took one look at the email trail, and said, "This isn't just overreach. This is enforceable harassment. Let's file a protective order." 2 days later, I filed a formal cease and desist demand against the HOA. Included were scanned documents, the audio clips, the historic designation files, and legal opinion letters from both a preservation attorney and a civil rights lawyer who'd worked on prior HOA abuse cases. I didn't send it to Karen. I sent it to the HOA's legal representative directly, certified mail, copy to the city. But I still wasn't done. I scheduled a private meeting with a city council member who chaired the Historic Preservation Subcommittee. I brought the full binder, photos of Elias, the original blueprints. She listened, took notes, nodded slowly when I showed her the video footage. And then she said, "We're opening a formal investigation, and if any city-recognized landmark is being threatened or defaced, there will be consequences for everyone involved." By the following week, I saw the ripple effect. Karen looked rattled. The smug, clipped tone in her emails was gone, replaced by phrases like pending clarification and coordinating with city records. But then, the twist. I got a letter from a lawyer. But not from the HOA. This one came from Linden Marr, a firm specializing in land use and historical property rights. The letter was brief. It simply read, "Mr. Reyes, we represent multiple community members concerned with the mishandling of protected structures in the Willow Bend development. Please be advised that legal action may be taken against the HOA board if further violations occur." I didn't know these community members personally, but someone had seen what was happening, and someone had decided to stand up. That weekend I went to the farmer's market like I always do. A man I didn't know, mid-50s, blue ball cap, walked up to me and said, "You Reyes's grandson?" I nodded. He smiled. "My dad laid the foundation on your place, said it was the most honest job he ever did." He handed me a folded note. Inside, a black and white photo from 1925. 5 workers standing in front of the half-finished fence. Elias was in the center, and on the back, in faded pencil, "Pride before property lines." I felt something shift in my chest, like the stone in the wall had just grown heavier and more unshakable. Karen had picked the wrong fight, because this wasn't just about height, this was about heritage. And now I had the law, the city, the state, and something bigger. I had the story, and I was ready to tell it, publicly. Because sometimes preserving history isn't quiet work. Sometimes you have to make noise. Sometimes preserving history isn't quiet work. Sometimes you have to make noise. And that's exactly what I plan to do. The next HOA meeting was set for Tuesday at 6:00 p.m. Usually these things were low-key, 10, maybe 12 people in folding chairs in the community center. But this time, word had gotten around. By 5:40, the parking lot was full. By 5:50, people were standing shoulder to shoulder against the back wall, and by 6 sharp, they had to open the sliding divider just to fit the rest of us. I walked in with a file box under one arm and the framed photo of Elias in the other. I didn't say anything, not yet. I took a seat in the front row, placed the photo on the table, and waited. Karen was already there, tight smile, paper stack in front of her, wearing that same pale blue blazer she always used for moments of pretend diplomacy. Beside her sat 2 other board members and their HOA lawyer, a man with a polished forehead and a clipped tie who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Good evening," Karen began. "We'll start with old business before addressing tonight's community concerns." Someone behind me muttered, "Yeah, we're all here for that concern." She ignored it. 5 minutes of boilerplate, budget adjustments, fountain repair quotes, then, and now, agenda item 5, non-compliant structures in the historic corridor zone. She didn't say my name, but she gestured directly at my fence. A projector flashed a photo of it on the wall, zoomed in, taken from an angle to exaggerate its height. "We have received multiple reports of visual discordance caused by oversized fencing inconsistent with Article 4 of Willow Bend HOA guidelines," Karen said smoothly. "These structures, though long-standing, create issues of safety, aesthetic imbalance, and neighbor discomfort." A few people nodded, some shifted uncomfortably. Then she looked up and said, "Mr. Reyes, would you like to respond?" I stood, walked slowly to the podium, and said nothing, for 10 full seconds. Just let the silence stretch until the weight of it made people lean in. Then I placed the framed photograph of Elias onto the podium's edge. "This is my great-grandfather, Elias Reyes," I said. "He built the wall on my property in 1924, by hand, with stone from a quarry 40 miles away." I held up the first document from the file box. "This is the city's official record, dated 1982, granting that structure historical landmark status under Ordinance 10.6. It explicitly protects it from modification or removal. That law supersedes any HOA guidelines." A murmur ran through the crowd. Karen cleared her throat. "We understand that history is important, but the neighborhood has evolved." I cut her off, calmly. "And so has the law." I pulled out a second file. "This is a letter from the Office of Historic Preservation, reaffirming the structure's protected status as of last month. Here's a signed affidavit from a city council member. And this," I held up a memory card, "is video footage and audio of HOA board members discussing a coordinated effort to pressure me into compliance in order to improve property values and curry favor with a developer." Gasps. One person actually whispered, "Whoa." Karen's face froze, but I wasn't done. These efforts included anonymous vandalism of a registered landmark, threats of daily fines outside legal jurisdiction, coordinated misinformation, and, most notably, a complet to disregard for the rights of homeowners who live within designated preservation zones. I turned to the board's lawyer. "I've submitted a formal complaint to the city and to the Attorney General's office. A protective order is now pending. Any further action taken by this board against my property could result in civil and criminal penalties." He blinked, visibly sweating. Then I turned to the crowd. "I know not everyone here cares about a stone fence, but this isn't just about rocks. It's about the stories we protect, the people who came before us. If we let policy erase memory, we lose more than aesthetics. We lose our roots. I stepped back. The room was silent. Then, clapping. One person, then two, then the entire back row. Karen tried to cut in. Order, please. This is highly irregular. But the crowd had turned. Voices rose. That fence was here before I was born. Why are we wasting dues on lawsuits? Karen, did you really talk to a developer about removing it? I thought we liked having character in our neighborhood. Then a new voice spoke from the rear. My name is David Kim. I'm the Deputy Director of the City Historic Committee, and I'd like to confirm that Mr. Reyes is entirely within his rights. Every head turned. He stepped forward, holding his badge, then placed a folder on the table in front of Karen. As of this morning, the city has issued a formal cease and desist order against any further action targeting the Reyes property. Additionally, we are opening an inquiry into the HOA's misuse of regulatory authority and potential violations of preservation law. Karen went pale. David continued, We recommend the immediate suspension of all enforcement related to the Ashbury Wall. Failure to comply will trigger state-level intervention, and just like that, the room shifted. Karen stammered, tried to pivot. We were only following guidelines. Our intentions were, but someone in the back called out, Resign, Karen, and that's when it broke. A storm of voices. You harassed him. We're tired of your rules. Let's vote now. The board tried to restore order, but it was gone. Within 20 minutes, the rest of the meeting had dissolved into impromptu testimonies. Neighbors started sharing other stories, silent fines, confusing notices, whispered threats. Turns out I wasn't the only one. I'd just been the most visible. By the end of the night, a motion had been introduced for a special election to replace the board chair. Several neighbors volunteered to serve on a reform committee. I didn't speak again. I just stood by the photo of Elias, watching, listening. And for the first time in months, I saw people look at me with something other than suspicion. I saw respect. I saw vindication. As I left the hall, someone tapped me on the shoulder. It was Steve, from 2 doors down. He looked embarrassed. I owe you an apology, he said. I stayed quiet too long, but I'm glad you didn't. I nodded. Because this wasn't just my victory. It was a warning to anyone who thinks paperwork is powerless. To anyone who thinks memory can be measured with a ruler, to anyone who mistakes silence for weakness. The wall was still standing, and so was I. The wall was still standing, and so was I. But what happened after the showdown was just as important as what happened in that room. The city's cease and desist order went into effect the next morning. I taped a copy to the inside of my front window, just above Elias's initials in the stone. No vandal touched it again. Within a week, Karen resigned from her position as HOA board chair. She didn't issue a public statement, just slipped an envelope into every mailbox labeled for immediate administrative transition. No apology, no accountability. But no more red X's either, and that was enough. A temporary board was installed, 3 neighbors who had sat silently through the PRSO as few years of policy creep. One of them, Mrs. Patel, stopped me on her first day and said, I think we forgot who we were supposed to be protecting. I nodded. We all had. I won't lie, things didn't fix themselves overnight. Some neighbors stayed distant, unsure whether to speak or wait for the dust to settle. Others offered quiet thanks, some even helping with the cleanup after the hearing. Steve, the one who had once crossed the street to avoid me, came over with a 6-pack and helped me replant the tomato vine my niece had cried over. And slowly, the silence that had filled the neighborhood began to lift. It started with small things. The kids began using the sidewalk again, chalk dust smeared in pastel blues and oranges across the pavement just outside the fence. Neighbors started waving again, some even lingered. I was walking the perimeter of the wall one afternoon when Miss Geneva, our oldest resident, called out from her porch, It's still the prettiest thing on the block, Michael. Always was. I smiled and tipped my hat. Then the city called. Apparently word had spread further than I thought. A city council member invited me to speak at a public heritage event on preserving community legacy and homeowner rights in historical zones. I brought the photo of Elias, spoke about the first stone he placed, about the chisel grooves that still held dust from a century ago, about the way a wall can separate and shelter at the same time. They gave me a certificate, but it wasn't the paper that mattered. It was the acknowledgement. The recognition that memory has value, and even more than that we had fought back and won. The new HOA board held a vote to amend Article 4. The clause about fence height was adjusted to specifically exempt any structure listed under city or state preservation status. They even included language that prohibited arbitrary reinterpretation of legacy designations without homeowner input and legal review. And then came the most unexpected moment of all. One evening, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Karen standing there. Not in her usual blazer, no clipboard, just jeans and a cardigan, holding a brown envelope. "I won't stay long," she said. I didn't say anything, just waited. "I didn't understand what that fence meant," she said, voice softer than I'd ever heard. "I was focused on, I don't know, improvement, symmetry, maybe proving something." She handed me the envelope. Inside were printed photos. From the city archives, black and white images of the neighborhood from the 1920s and 30s. One of them showed Elias with a group of workers, smiling, sleeves rolled, standing beside the half-finished wall. The caption read, "Ashbury Avenue, 1924, handcrafted boundary completed by Reyes family." "I pulled those after the meeting," Karen said. "I thought maybe they belonged with you." Then she left. I closed the door, stood in the hallway a long time, and then added the photo to the frame beside Elias's portrait. My niece noticed the new addition the next day. She leaned in, pointing at the workers. "Which one's him?" "The one in the center," I said. "But every single person in that photo built this place. That's why it matters." She smiled. "He looks like you." We spent that weekend fixing the last bit of the garden together. Put in a new trellis. Hung up the old lanterns we used to use during wintertime. By Sunday, the bees were back, the tomatoes were budding, and the neighborhood felt like Willowbend again. Not perfect, but real. Messy, proud, imperfectly beautiful, like a wall with chisel marks that refuses to come down. And here's the thing. The fence never moved an inch, but everything else changed. Neighbors stopped seeing it as non-compliant and started calling it what it always was, part of who we are, a monument to grit, to craft, to story. They even added it as a stop on the Willowbend Historical Walking Tour. The guide calls it Reyes Wall, Legacy in Stone. I just call it home. Karen moved out 6 months later. Her house sold for market price, no higher, no lower, just fair. And now, the HOA still exists, but it listens. The meetings are open, the policies transparent. They even held a vote to name the community garden after Elias. I declined politely, but I was moved. And one night, as I watched my niece chase fireflies along the fence line, I realized something. What they tried to erase only became more permanent. They tried to draw a red X through my history. Instead, they underlined it. They tried to take away a fence. What they lost was control. Closing line options. Choose one or use both for dramatic finish. Elias laid the first stone in 1924. 100 years later, we're still building on it. Or, Betty laid her 500th egg this week, and I laid down the law. If you've ever had to fight for something others thought was small, but you knew it carried generations behind it, you're not alone. Leave a comment and tell me, what's one thing you'd never let them take from you? And if this story hit home, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, sometimes a wall isn't just a wall, it's a line you don't let them cross.